There is a bade in North Wales that Queen Victoria refused to sleep in. It was carved from 1 tonne of local slate, polished to a dark gleam, and placed in a specially prepared bedroom in Penrhyn Castle for a royal visit in 1859. The headboard and footboard rose like slabs from the mattress. Victoria took one look and said it reminded her of a tombstone. She slept elsewhere. The bed is still there. It sits in the room where it was placed over 160 years ago, and visitors file past it with the same uneasy fascination that the Queen herself must have felt. Because the bed is not just a piece of furniture, it is a statement. It was carved from the same stone that built the castle, quarried from the same mountain that made the family rich, cut by the same men whose labour paid for everything you can see from the castle windows, from the terraced gardens to the port on the Menai Strait, to the roads and railways and churches and schools and workers' cottages that stretch across the landscape of Snowdonia like the threads of a web. And at the centre of that web, vast and dark and silent, sits the castle itself. Penrhyn. 300 rooms, neo-Norman turrets and battlements designed to look 800 years old but built between 1822 and 1837. Brand new, a fantasy of medieval power erected on a hillside above Bangor by a family whose fortune came from two sources: slate and sugar, stone and slavery. The interior is overwhelming. The grand staircase rises through the building with the weight and confidence of a cathedral. The library ceiling is covered in intricate Norman plasterwork, so fine it looks like lacework cast in stone. The great hall soars to a height that reduces visitors to silence. On the walls hang paintings by Rembrandt and Canalettos, collected by a family that believed its wealth entitled it to the finest things the world could produce. In the stable block, now a railway museum, two carriages sit side by side. One is an open bench car with no roof and no cushions, in which quarry workers rode to the rock face each morning, exposed to the rain and the cold and the wind off the mountain. The other is a polished, elevated carriage with cushioned swivel chairs and stained glass windows, in which the owners and their guests rode. No caption is needed. The distance between those two carriages is the distance between the men who broke the rock and the men who sold it. If you have ever wondered what a building made entirely from human suffering looks like, Penrhyn Castle is as close as Britain gets to an answer. And if these deep investigations into the families and empires behind Britain and Ireland's greatest landmarks are worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which property we should investigate next, and help these stories find the audience they deserve. The architect was Thomas Hopper. His client was George Hay Dawkins Pennant, a man who had inherited the Penrhyn estate from his second cousin Richard Pennant, the first Baron Penrhyn, and who intended to transform a modest Georgian mansion into something that would announce the family's wealth to the world with the subtlety of a cannon shot. Hopper chose the Norman style, not Gothic, which was fashionable in the 1820s and would have been the expected choice for a Welsh castle revival, not Palladian, which was safe and classical and respectable. Norman, the architecture of William the Conqueror, the architecture of domination, the style of the men who had built the Tower of London and Rochester Castle, and the great fortress keeps that still stand in towns across England and Wales, fortresses designed not to defend against foreign enemies, but to subdue a conquered population. The keep at Penrhyn was modelled directly on Rochester. It rises 5 stories, square and massive, with battlements at the top and enormous Gothic windows that betray the building's true age to anyone who looks closely. A real Norman keep would never have had windows that large. It would have had arrow slits. But Penrhyn was not built for defence. It was built for display. The symbolism was precise, even if Dawkins Pennant did not consciously intend it. because domination was exactly what the Pennant family had practiced for 200 years on two continents over two entirely different groups of people who had one thing in common. They had no choice. The construction took 15 years and consumed enormous quantities of local stone, timber, and human effort. Much of the timber came from the family's own forests in Snowdonia. Much of the labour came from the family's own quarry workers, men who spent their days splitting rock on a mountainside and their evenings building the castle that their labour would fill with Rembrandts and Canalettos and hand-carved Norman furniture and a grand staircase that rises through the centre of the building like a stone spine. The estimated cost was £150,000, roughly £49 million in today's money. It was, by any measure, an act of extraordinary vanity. Dawkins' Pennant lived only 3 years after it was finished. He died in 1840, having spent 15 years building a monument to a fortune he had not earned, derived from an industry he had not founded, sustained by a labour force, both enslaved and free, that he had never troubled himself to understand. The castle passed to his daughter Juliana, whose husband Edward Gordon Douglas adopted the name Pennant and became the first Lord Penrhyn of Llandegai. The cycle continued. The slate kept coming, the money kept flowing, and the people who produced it kept dying. The Pennant fortune begins in Jamaica in 1656 with a soldier named Gifford. He was from Flintshire, the grandson of Thomas Pennant, abbot of Basingwork Abbey in Holywell, and he arrived in Jamaica as a captain in Oliver Cromwell's invasion force, part of the army that seized the island from Spain in 1655. Jamaica was to be England's answer to the Spanish sugar colonies. To develop the island quickly, the Crown offered generous land grants to soldiers and settlers, and Gifford Pennant took full advantage. He was a shrewd and relentless operator. He bought and sold land with a speed and appetite that outpaced every other planter on the island, accumulating holdings 18 to 20 times larger than the average, eventually owning over 7,000 acres across the parishes of Clarendon and Westmoreland. He entered politics on the island, became a member of the Assembly for Clarendon, and by the time he died in 1676, he was one of the largest landowners in Jamaica. His descendants expanded the empire across 3 generations, 6 sugar plantations, 3 livestock pens for rearing cattle, hundreds, and eventually nearly 1,000, enslaved Africans working the fields under conditions of systematic brutality that the historical record documents with numbing precision. The sugar trade was the engine of the British Atlantic economy. Raw cane was cut, crushed, boiled, and refined by enslaved workers in temperatures that could reach 50 degrees inside the boiling houses. The mortality rate on Jamaican sugar plantations was so high that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. It had to be continuously replenished through the transatlantic slave trade. The Pennant's wealth depended on this cycle. Every barrel of sugar shipped from Clarendon to Liverpool represented not just a commodity, but a human cost that the family chose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to see. Jamaica was difficult to live on, even for the men who profited from it. Tropical storms, yellow fever, malaria, the constant threat of slave rebellion that hung over every plantation like the heat itself. The overwhelming violence of daily life in a society built on forced labour. By the 1730s, the 3 Pennant brothers, Samuel, Henry, and John, had all returned to Britain, leaving the running of their plantations in the hands of agents while they enjoyed the profits from a safe and comfortable distance. Samuel was knighted and became Lord Mayor of London in 1749. He died the following year after contracting jail fever, that is typhus, while presiding over a case at the Old Bailey. A Lord Mayor killed by the diseases of the poor he was supposed to govern. Both Samuel and Henry died without children, leaving everything to John, who operated as a West India merchant in Liverpool, Britain's largest slaving port, managing the sale and distribution of sugar and rum produced by enslaved workers he would never meet. John's son Richard would change everything. Richard Pennant was born in 1737, probably in London, possibly during a voyage from Jamaica. He married Anne Susanna Warburton, the daughter of General Hugh Warburton, and through her acquired the other half of the Penrhyn estate in Caernarfonshire, along with part ownership of a slate quarry near Bethesda. He became Member of Parliament for Petersfield in 1761 and then for Liverpool in 1767, a seat that placed him at the beating heart of Britain's slave trade economy. Liverpool was the largest slaving port in the country, the city from which more ships sailed to the coast of Africa to purchase human beings than from any other harbour in the British Isles. Richard Pennant represented that city and its interests with unwavering loyalty. He was elevated to the peerage as Baron Penrhyn in 1783, an Irish peerage that did not prevent him from continuing to sit in the House of Commons. And from this position of political and economic power, he did two things simultaneously. He built an industrial empire in North Wales that would transform the landscape of an entire region, and he fought, with every resource at his disposal, to keep slavery alive. Richard Pennant became chairman of the West India Committee, the organisation of merchants and plantation owners that coordinated parliamentary opposition to abolition. From 1788, he chaired a special subcommittee tasked with defeating the abolitionist movement. The committee sponsored petitions, produced pamphlets defending the slave trade, and lobbied members of Parliament with arguments about economic catastrophe. In 1789, Pennant stood in the House of Commons and declared that if they passed the vote of abolition, they actually struck at 70 millions of property, ruined the colonies, and by destroying an essential nursery of seamen, gave up the dominion of the sea at a single glance. He was not defending an abstraction, he was defending his income. By 1805, Richard Pennant owned nearly 1,000 enslaved people across 4 plantations in Jamaica. The average Jamaican plantation held 150. His held 250 each. He never visited the island. He managed his properties through letters in which he referred to enslaved people as his chattels, grouping them with cattle under the same term. In one letter he wrote, "I do not wish the cattle nor Negroes to be overworked." Whether this was compassion or asset management remains, as historians have noted, impossible to determine. Despite his direct involvement in the slave trade, Richard Pennant was known in North Wales as the Improver. And in a narrow, brutal sense, the title was accurate. He took his Jamaican profits and invested them in the slate quarry at Bethesda, transforming a small local operation into an industrial colossus that would eventually become the largest slate quarry in the world. He built Port Penrhyn, the harbour from which slate would be shipped to rooftops on every continent. He built roads and railways to connect the quarry to the coast. He built workers' houses, churches, schools, and hotels. He transformed the economy of an entire region of Wales with money generated by the forced labour of enslaved Africans 3,000 miles away. His obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1808 noted that the money from Jamaica had paid for roads, railways, houses, schools, and the Penrhyn Quarry, and had changed the landscape of North Wales forever. It did not describe this as a moral problem. It described it as an achievement. The slave trade was abolished in 1807, 1 year before Richard Pennant died. He had fought abolition for nearly 20 years and lost. But abolition of the trade did not mean abolition of slavery itself. The enslaved people on the Pennant plantations continued to work the sugar fields for another quarter of a century. Slavery was not outlawed in British colonies until between 1833 and 1838. A full generation after the trade in new slaves had been banned. George Hay Dawkins Pennant, Richard's heir, opposed emancipation with the same vigour his cousin had opposed abolition, sitting on the West India Committee and voting against every measure that threatened the system that sustained his income. When abolition finally came, the Pennants received £14,683 and 17 shillings from the British government in compensation. Not compensation for the enslaved people who had spent their lives in bondage. Compensation for the owners who had profited from their suffering. 764 human beings were freed from the Pennant plantations in Clarendon Parish, and the family that had owned them, that had bought and sold them, that had listed them as chattels alongside cattle in estate inventories, was paid for the inconvenience of losing its property. In today's money, that compensation is approximately £1.3 million. The enslaved people received nothing. They were given their freedom and left to survive in a colonial economy that had been designed from the ground up to exploit them. The profitability of the West Indies sugar industry fell sharply after emancipation, as the plantation system collapsed without the forced labour that had sustained it for 2 centuries. But by then, it did not matter. The Pennants had already transferred their wealth into slate. By the time slavery ended, the Pennants no longer needed Jamaica. They had already transferred their wealth into slate, and slate was about to make them richer than sugar ever had. Penrhyn Quarry, perched on the side of a mountain above the village of Bethesda in the Ogwen Valley, became the largest slate quarry in the world. It was not a mine, it was an open pit carved into the mountainside in enormous stepped terraces that descended hundreds of feet into the earth, each level connected by inclines and narrow gauge railways that carried rock and men up and down the face of the excavation. By the 1890s, the Welsh slate industry employed approximately 17,000 workers and produced nearly 500,000 tonnes of slate a year, roughly a third of all roofing slate used anywhere on Earth. Welsh slate covered Westminster Hall in the Houses of Parliament. It covered Copenhagen City Hall. It covered the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne, Australia. It covered the terraced houses of Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham, the factory roofs of the Midlands, the chapel roofs of the Welsh valleys. Penrhyn slate was, quite literally, the roof of the Industrial Revolution. The men who quarried it worked in conditions that were, by any standard, appalling. The quarry was an open wound in the mountain, with rock faces rising vertically around the workers, exposed to rain and wind and the bitter cold of North Welsh winters. Blasting was constant. Falling slate fragments were a daily hazard. Crushed limbs, shattered hands and lost fingers were common injuries. Fatal accidents happened regularly, and the silica dust that hung in the air caused a lung disease that killed quarrymen slowly over decades, filling their chests with stone long after they had left the rock face. The average life expectancy of a Penrhyn quarryman was significantly lower than the national average. The men worked in small gangs under a system called the bargain, in which each gang negotiated with management for a section of rock and was paid according to the quality and quantity of slate they produced. If your gang drew a good section, where the rock split cleanly along its natural planes, you could earn a decent living. If you drew a poor section, where the stone was fractured or veined or refused to cleave, your pay could fall to almost nothing, even after weeks of backbreaking, dangerous work. The system gave the quarrymen a sense of identity as contractors rather than employees, skilled craftsmen rather than hired labour. It also gave management an instrument of control. Because the allocation of bargains was not random, it was decided by the quarry office. A compliant worker might find himself on good rock, A troublemaker might find himself on bad. The quarrymen were allowed only Christmas Day as a holiday. They were overseen by managers who were often English-speaking in a workforce that was overwhelmingly Welsh-speaking and non-conformist in its religion, creating a cultural and linguistic divide that mirrored the class divide between the men who owned the mountain and the men who broke it apart with their hands. Lord Penrhyn, the second Baron, George Sholto Gordon Douglas Pennant, nicknamed his two daughters Sugar and Slate. It was meant as a joke. It was also a confession. On the 22nd of November 1900, 2,800 quarrymen walked out of Penrhyn Quarry and into the cold November air. They did not know it yet, but they were beginning the longest industrial dispute in British history. The strike would last 3 years. It would destroy a community, and it would leave scars that have not healed in over a century. The dispute had been building for years. Lord Penrhyn and his quarry manager, Emilios Young, had been fighting to eliminate the influence of the North Wales Quarrymen's Union. In April 1900, Young announced that trade union contributions would no longer be collected at the quarry. Tensions boiled over in October when violence broke out against a number of contractors. Penrhyn pressed assault charges against 26 quarrymen and dismissed them before their case was even heard. When the matter came to court, the entire quarry workforce marched to Bangor to show their support. They were all suspended for 2 weeks. When they returned, 800 men found their sections of the quarry had been closed. They had no bargain, no work, no pay. 3 days later, on the 22nd of November, the remaining 2,000 quarrymen refused to work until their colleagues were reinstated. Young gave them an ultimatum: go on working or leave the quarry quietly. They left. A month later, Young offered new terms. 77 men accepted. 1,707 refused. The quarry closed. What followed was a slow, grinding catastrophe. The quarrymen had no savings. Their families had no income. The village of Bethesda, which depended almost entirely on the quarry for its livelihood, began to starve. Women took in washing. Children were pulled from school to scavenge for food. Families who had lived comfortably on quarry wages found themselves unable to pay rent, unable to buy bread, unable to heat their homes through the bitter Snowdonia winters. Sympathisers across Britain raised money and sent food, and the solidarity was extraordinary. Trade unions from every corner of the country contributed to strike funds. One company in Ashton-under-Lyne sent a Christmas pudding weighing 2.5 tons. The chapels of Bethesda, which were the spiritual and social centre of the community, organised relief, held services, provided counsel, and maintained morale through month after month of deepening hardship. But charity could not replace wages, and Lord Penrhyn knew it. He could wait. He had a castle and a fortune, and the patience of a man who had never gone hungry. The quarrymen had nothing but their resolve and each other. In June 1901, he reopened the quarry and invited approved workers to return. The word approved was deliberate. It meant compliant. It meant men who would accept the new terms, abandon the union, and submit to the authority of the Quarry Office without complaint. Cards appeared in the windows of houses across Bethesda. They read in Welsh, Nid oes bradwa in I ti hwn. There is no traitor in this house. The cards were a declaration of solidarity, handwritten or printed, placed in the front window where neighbours and passers-by could see them. They were also a test. If your card came down, it meant you had broken. You had gone back to the quarry. You had chosen your family's survival over your community's dignity. And the community would remember. It would remember for generations. By 1902, 700 men had returned to the quarry, most of them broken by hunger and debt, and the impossibility of feeding children on principle alone. Another 2,000 had left Bethesda entirely, scattering across Wales and England in search of work, most heading south to the coalfields of the Rhondda, the Cynon, and the Swansea valleys, trading one dangerous industry for another, carrying with them the Welsh language and the nonconformist faith, and the bitter memory of what Lord Penrhyn had done. The community of Bethesda had been changed forever. Lord Penrhyn built new houses for the strikebreakers, away from the centre of the village, physically separating the men who had yielded from the men who had held. The geography of betrayal was built into the streets. The police, under a chief constable, whose conduct was later investigated by a county council inquiry that found officers had acted without regard to the liberties of those on strike, beat strikers and left attacks by strikebreakers unpunished. The law was not neutral. It never had been. The strike ended in November 1903. The men went back on Lord Penrhyn's terms. The union was still unrecognised. The strike leaders were refused re-employment and many left the area permanently, their names erased from the quarry rolls as surely as the names of enslaved Africans had been erased from the plantation records a century before. It was not hearts or minds that decided the issue. It was empty stomachs. The effects of the Great Strike are still felt in Bethesda today. Rows of houses are still known locally as Tai Bradwyr, traitors' houses. The name has outlasted the people who lived in them. It has outlasted the quarry's peak production, outlasted the slate industry's dominance, outlasted the British Empire itself. Some residents of the Ogwen Valley still refuse to visit Penrhyn Castle, not because they cannot afford the entrance fee, but because of what the building represents. A castle built with slave money, maintained with quarry profits, standing on a hill above a community that it exploited for 2 centuries and then abandoned when the profits dried up. The Pennant family itself did not survive its own creation. The third Lord Penrhyn's 2 brothers, George and Charles, were killed in the First World War, along with his son and heir, Alan. The fourth Lord Penrhyn, Hugh Napier, Douglas Pennant, inherited a castle, a quarry in decline, and a name that the people of Bethesda had learned to hate. He sold the last of the family's Jamaican plantations in 1940. A community in Jamaica is still called Pennants today. It was named after the family. The family also gave their surname to the people they enslaved. Hugh Napier never recovered from the losses of the war. He turned to alcohol for solace, as his biographers put it. His wife, Lady Sybil, who had been a great entertainer and had brought the castle to life with weekend parties and wartime fundraising, eventually divorced him. He died alone in Penrhyn Castle in 1949. He was the last Lord Penrhyn to live in the building he was born to inherit, drinking himself to death in 300 rooms that no single family could ever have needed, surrounded by Rembrandts and Canalettos and a 1-ton slate bed that even a queen had found too heavy to bear. 2 years later, the castle and 40,000 acres of land were accepted by the Treasury in lieu of death duties from Hugh Napier's niece, Lady Janet Pelham, who had adopted the surname Douglas Pennant on inheriting. It passed to the National Trust in 1951, which has been grappling with the building's history ever since. For most of the 20th century, the Trust, like most heritage organisations in Britain, presented its properties as celebrations of décès, craftsmanship, and aristocratic culture. The sources of the wealth that built them were not discussed. The enslaved people who generated the capital were not mentioned. The workers who quarried the stone were acknowledged only as part of an industrial heritage narrative that emphasized productivity and ingenuity rather than exploitation and suffering. Penrhyn Castle was presented as the home of a family of improvers. In 2007, coinciding with the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, staff at Penrhyn developed an exhibition called Sugar and Slavery the Penrhyn Connection. It was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and included contributions from children in Jamaica, England and Wales, and from local interest groups. It was thoughtful and serious and necessary. It represented the first sustained attempt to tell the full story of the building and the fortune that created it. By 2014, it had been shrunk to a small display in a room off the main visitor route, where most visitors never saw it. In 2018, an art installation by Welsh author Manon Steffan Ross called 12 Stories was mounted in the castle, addressing the family's enslavement of African people. According to the Trust's own researcher, Eleanor Harding, over the 6 months the piece was displayed, the Penrhyn staff and volunteer team felt insufficiently confident and knowledgeable to present this history sensitively and appropriately. That is a remarkable admission. It means that the people charged with caring for Penrhyn Castle did not feel equipped to explain how the building came to exist. By 2019, there were only 2 items on display in the entire 300-room castle that explicitly referenced slavery. 2 items. In a building that would not exist without it. Professor Olivette Otel, an expert in colonial history and the memory of slavery at the University of Bristol, visited in 2016 and noted the dominant narrative presented at Penrhyn. The Pennants were portrayed as social, industrial, and agrarian improvers. The enslavement that funded every improvement was largely invisible. The historian Alastair Hennessy, writing in History Today as early as 1995, put it more bluntly. There is no building, he wrote, which illustrates so graphically the role which slave plantation profits played in the growth of British economic power. In 2021, the slate landscape of northwest Wales, including Penrhyn Castle, was granted UNESCO World Heritage status. The citation celebrated the quarries, the railways, the ports, and the communities that slate had built. It acknowledged the global significance of the industry. It did not dwell on where the original capital came from. The same money quarried the mountain, shipped the slate, built the roads, erected the churches, and raised a 300-room castle with a 1-ton bed that even Queen Victoria could not bring herself to lie down in. Bangor University now holds the Pennant family papers, one of the largest and most significant estate archives in Europe, and in 2024 received Welsh Government funding to digitise the Jamaica records and make them freely available online. The documents preserve a detailed record of the plantation management, the lives of enslaved Africans, the politics of colonialism and abolition, and the investment of slavery wealth across the institutions of northwest Wales. The truth, it seems, is finally being assembled. Whether the castle can bear its weight remains to be seen. Stand at the gates of Penrhyn Castle today, and you stand at the intersection of 3 histories that the building was designed to keep separate. The history of Caribbean slavery, which provided the capital. The history of Welsh industrial labour, which provided the product. And the history of British aristocratic display, which provided the justification. The castle connects them all. It is the place where sugar money became slate money, where plantation profits became quarry profits, where the exploitation of enslaved Africans in Jamaica funded the exploitation of Welsh quarrymen in Bethesda, where the architecture of conquest was used to celebrate the fruits of extraction, and where the whole arrangement was presented to the world as improvement. The Pennants improved Jamaica by growing sugar on land cleared by enslaved workers. They improved North Wales by quarrying slate from a mountain worked by men who were allowed 1 holiday a year. They improved Penrhyn by building a castle so magnificent that Queen Victoria came to stay. And when Victoria arrived, the one thing the family offered her that she could not accept was a bed made from the same stone that had built everything else. A bed that looked like a tomb, because that is what Penrhyn Castle is. It is a tomb, a tomb for the enslaved Africans whose names were never recorded, a tomb for the quarrymen who died of silicosis and rockfall, a tomb for the community of Bethesda, which was broken by the Great Strike and never fully recovered, a tomb for the Pennant family itself, which drank itself to extinction in the very rooms it had spent 2 centuries filling with plundered beauty. The building survives. The people it consumed do not. If this story challenged you, surprised you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which property, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.